So the first thing we'll do is take a small food can. Now there actually are a number of reasons why you would want to cut up such materials. If you have a couple of cans like this, there's a number of ways you can make stoves out of them which produce a lot of heat from very little fuel. There's all kinds of useful videos on that. But even just one normal can, you can make a nice little hobo stove by poking a couple of holes here, poking a couple of holes in the back. You get a drawer that comes in here, comes up like a chimney, and you got a nice little windproof stove. Now that's about the worst way you can cut this. It's not nice to cut for a number of reasons. And you can see it takes a fair amount of force to drive the blade through it. So we've done a few cuts. Now if we have a look at the edge on the Delica, under light we can see a few spots where the edge is rolled. You're going to notice a fairly significant change right away in the ability to cut paper. I'll use another sheet, not one like that. And you can see already it's jiggering a bit. And that you would expect, because that's a thicker metal, but these ribs twist around on the edge. Now for anyone thinking that it looks much more difficult with Kyley's knife, it is, but that's only because the can is not actually there anymore and there's nothing to support the cuts. So as soon as the knife goes into it, everything starts to move. So there's a nice little octopus. Looking at the edge on Kyley's knife, same thing. There's a couple of little spots where the edge is reflecting light, and I can sort of feel it with my finger where the edge is sort of catching a little bit. But looking at it straight on, this is relatively minor damage, like you're not going to see it on the camera at all. If anything, Kyley's knife actually did a bit better. Of course, if you go up to the region where I never did anything with it, it still starts to cut fairly well until it hits one of the bumpy regions. So you could be like the Ginsu commercials where they do all the cutting down in this region and then they take the knife up here and slice through a tomato and say, hey, it's really sharp now. Thicker can. And this is one of the areas where you'll see a longer blade sort of getting in the way. If I was trying to do a cut now, I'd actually smack the other edge up there. So again, few cuts through rib cans. Have a look at the edge. Much more rolling visible here now when I'm looking at it. But again, the damage is so small, you're not going to see it on camera. So for most people, this out of the way, see if I can make one more cut. That was difficult. So for most people, that's pretty much probably going to be the hardest material they're going to cut, if they're going to cut that. And there's very little to no damage on the edge of the knife. You still can't see anything on camera. I can feel a little bit with my fingernail. And you'll definitely see an impact on slicing paper and stuff like that. But otherwise, still no damage. Now, it's difficult to imagine a material harder to cut up than this, unless you're trying to whittle a concrete block or something. This is a piece of shingle. Most people still call them asphalt shingles. They're actually asphalt fiberglass shingles. The top of them is covered in essentially rock. It's extremely abrasive. It's very difficult to cut. They're usually cut with cheap replaceable blades. I just had to clean out the nails because there's a couple of them in these pieces. Now, this is going to dull any edge. Doesn't matter what it's made out of. It's going to damage any edge. Doesn't matter what it's made out of. Again, all I'm looking at is, even on material this hard, does this extra angle actually help you out? Couple of layers there. Now, one thing I should say, I'm comparing the Delica to Kyley's knife and talking about the difference in cutting ability. And sort of saying that the Spyderco can't keep up, and it can't. But you can see it's relatively easily working through this material. Here's a couple of layers. That's a bit too difficult. But compared to most other production blades, that'll fare fairly well. The problem is you got a standard here, like on a scale from 1 to 10, about how well knives cut. This knife is at an 8 or a 9. There's very little you could do to improve this. You could completely zero the edge. Even if you did zero the edge, you're talking about a change in edge angle going from around 11 to 13 degrees to maybe 6 to 8 degrees. You're talking about a very small refinement that's possible to make. You can just hear this sort of cracking as it goes through the stone. It's an early material to work with. Get out of the way, buddy. Ah, fine, there's a decent piece. Doesn't want to come up. And again, the outer part of this is filled with very abrasive material. But again, you can see both knives are cutting through that decently well. And of course, you end up with gum along the blade. And you scratch up the primary grind fairly harshly, of course. Now, by this point, there's really no sharpness left on this edge whatsoever. Both of them have sort of been fairly blunted. So if I was to take this to a piece of paper, you're probably going to see some ripping more than anything else. Surprisingly, made a decent shot at it. The edge is very ragged. It is ripping it, but still. And if anything, just comparing them on this, which is fairly difficult to get a precise measurement, but if anything, Kyley's knife cut through more of the material and seems to have a greater, finer edge left. And while I said these edges are slightly damaged, they're damaged to the point that you can see damage on them. You can pick it up on fine paper. If you go back to something like a piece of wood like this, both of these knives still whittle the wood. Now if you look at the surface of the wood, you can see that it's damaged. So somebody who's actually like a wood carver or a carpenter would actually notice a functional effect. Now you are having to put a bit more force on it, of course, because the knife is not as sharp anymore. But still, this knife, even after the asphalt shingles and the metals and the plastic, can still cut wood. Go back to Kyley's knife and get that out of the way. Easy. And in fact, looking at the edge of the wood, they're not comparable. Kyley's knife is leaving much smoother cuts. Yeah, right away. So if anything, the edge is not as heavily damaged. And of course, the cutting ability is much greater. And you can see as I power into the wood, it's much easier to lift thicker chips. And that again is because the edge is much more acute. So, even after working up to food cans and even asphalt shingles, still haven't seen any benefit to the increased edge angle or the increased edge thickness on the Spyderco Delica. And again, all I'm trying to do is give a sort of rough idea of the kind of limits that you can actually get with a geometry like this